Hi, welcome to Back to Excited, episode 148. My name is Irvin. Joining me as always, my colleague from PensionPlanPuppets.com. It's Acting the Foolaman.
Hi, everybody.
So, there's been a bit of delay between podcasts for, I guess, I forget the reasons at this point. It's been so long.
They're mostly my fault, to be clear. I was doing a variety of work things, and they kept getting in the way. And so, we've been on one of our longer hiatuses of our podcasting career, although not entirely, because we did guest on the Maple Leafs Hot Stove podcast.
Yes, that's true. So, today we're planning on bringing back something we tried for the first time last year and had good reception. It's a lot of fun. It's a very kind of off-season-y thing to do, which is perfect for the Leafs because we have lots of off-season time to deal with. And that's ranking the top 10 U22 players in the NHL. So we'll get into that first, but we would be remiss to not point out and not acknowledge some of the tragic news that happened today in the NHL with the really unfortunate passing of Columbus Blue Jackets goaltender Matisse Kivlenieks over the 4th of July weekend in what's been described as essentially a firework accident.
Yeah, that's just very sad.
Yeah, there's really nothing to say aside from the fact that it's really, really, really sad that it must be, a time of really intense and, severe pain for his friends and family and his teammates and the people who knew him. And yeah, it's just, our a small comfort, but yeah, our condolences very much go towards anyone impacted by this really tragic event.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, hopefully the rest of the podcast can be a bit lighter, but we did want to, acknowledge that and we'll go from there. So, as I pointed out, we're ranking the top 10 U22 players in the NHL. The age is as of July 1st, 2021. So as of a few days ago. And yeah, this is always a fun exercise because, you get to look kind of towards the future. You get to see and take stock of the young talent that's going to take the league kind of by storm over the next few years. So I guess the way we'll mostly go about this, we'll talk a bit about the people we have on the fringes at first, and then we'll kind of go through the list in reverse order. The one thing I did want to mention is that I think this is a weaker list than last year's.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would definitely agree with that. We had Elias Pettersson heading the list last year, followed by Andrei Svechnikov. Pettersson has graduated, and, Pettersson's a very special player. And so no one of his caliber has emerged. And I think, there are still cool and impressive players on this list. I wish fewer of them were from the Atlantic Division, but not the Leafs. But I guess you can't have everything in life. But I do think that some very fine players have graduated. Mind you, Patrick Laine is gone, and I have no idea what to make of him at this point. So
yeah. Cale Makar as well, I think, is probably the other really, really big one who's graduated. Like he and Pettersson would have been vying for 1-2, basically.
Yeah, and they're both guys like next year. Pettersson could contend for the Hart, and Makar could contend for the Norris. I'm not saying that they necessarily will, but it's an entirely believable outcome for both of them. So that's a very high bar.
Yeah. So this isn't like a bad list, but I think, we over the past few years, the quality of like the really top end young players coming into the league has taken a step back. It's been, I shouldn't say taken a step back, it's returned to more what is normal, as opposed to that crazy run of, Matthews, McDavid, Eichel, Marner, McKinnon coming into the league in relatively quick succession.
Yeah, I think that's something that will become clear as we go through this list, is that it's just really, really hard to be an effective NHL player as a teenager. And I think sometimes when comparing players to McDavid and Matthews, who are two of the best players of the generation, or McKinnon, but even then McKinnon wasn't what he has since become.
Yeah, McKinnon
really to debut
exploded later.
Yeah, to debut this strongly right after your draft year is so difficult. And
if we ever had McKinnon on one of these lists post his rookie year, it would be like, oh, is this guy actually shaping up to be all that good, right? He exploded after he turned like 22, I think.
Yeah, we've mentioned this before, but he seemed to have everything pretty much going for him, except he wasn't a great finisher. And then one year, It just clicked. And then he was amazing because he acquired maybe the most useful skill in hockey to go with everything he already had. He's an insane skater. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see sort of the developing crop of players and how some of them have moved. I think that I won't spoil anything, but there's a player who has moved prominently up our list this year. And I think that, having a rough introductory season to the NHL is a big factor in that.
Yes. So the way this worked is that, Fullman and I both ranked them individually, and then we just averaged the ranks, but we gave more weight to mine because I'm more correct.
The system is corrupt.
No, we weighted them 50-50. So without any further ado, let's get into discussing it. So we'll talk quickly about some players who just missed. Who just missed the cut. So these are our ranks 11 through 15. The way it is, we ranked the top 16 players. We ranked the top 15 players, then assigned everyone else a score of 16. With the idea being we're only really going to talk in detail about the top 10, so it's fine. But our 11 to 15 was Nils Höglander of the Canucks, Tim Stützle of the Senators, Trevor Zegras of the Ducks, Capo Kakko of the Rangers, and Rasmus Dahlin of the Sabres. So are there any immediate thoughts you have about any of these players?
Right. The one that I want to make a real point about is actually Tim Stützle from the Ottawa Senators, because his stats this year, not very impressive at all. But every time I watched him when we played the Senators, I was like, this guy's going to be a star. And the eye test is prone to being misleading, absolutely. And there are sometimes players who just always look very good and flashy, but don't deliver in a huge way. Jonathan Drouin comes to mind. But Tim Stützle, I strongly suspect is going to be one hell of a hockey player. I actually had him 10th on my list, so I kind of tried to sneak him in there, even though I know that there was not the strongest stats basis. And, I don't go out of my way to do favors for the Ottawa Senators, not a favored team of the Toronto Maple Leafs, but I really genuinely just believe that he's going to be good. If we do this in a year, I bet he's on the list.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good bet that he'll be on the list next year, right? He was not a very good player at, age, I think 18 for most of the year. Mm-hmm. But that's common. We saw the same thing happen with Capo Kakko last year, and Kakko had a much better year this year. Now he still didn't make our list, but he in his rookie year, Kakko was maybe the worst regular player in the NHL. This year, he looked like, just a decent player.
Yeah, he was not the worst regular player in the NHL. Hooray for progress. Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, that's a recurring theme that we talk about. It's so hard to come in at 18 or 19 and be effective. And the players who do that are extraordinary. But the players who fail to do that aren't necessarily doomed either. There's a lot of growing that takes place between 18 and 22. And part of the reason we do this list is to kind of keep tabs on these players and know who we might be hearing more about in the years to come. This was a big disparity between us. It might be the biggest one, is I was quite high on Nils Höglander, and you were a skeptic. You weren't buying it. You still have the Vancouver Canucks.
Yes. I mean, maybe I should have ranked Höglander a bit higher. He looks good, right? Mm-hmm. He does look good. And his isolated impact by HockeyViz is astoundingly good. Actually, it's very, very, very impressive. With Höglander, I guess my thoughts on him are that I don't fully see the elite upside. I think he can be a good, second liner, more or less, right? And maybe this is me being, normally I default really to trusting the stats, but I did actually get to watch a lot of Vancouver this year, and I thought Höglander was good, but yeah, I just didn't really see the elite upside. I think the all-in-one stats, or the play driving stats, might not totally be capturing his usage, which I think was, a little bit friendly, as it should be. That's not a bad thing. So I'm a little bit lower on him than you are, but I absolutely can see a world where, I look very, very stupid for doing so.
Well, what's the point of lists if not to make yourself look silly in a year or two? So
yeah.
Yeah.
We should just briefly mention Dahlin, because we talked about him last year as okay, next year's kind of a make or break year, and it was more break than make.
Yeah, it wasn't. We had Kevin on the pod last time, and I always like hearing from him about Sabres prospects. Well, mention him again because I got some quotes from him on another player. But it just feels like Dahlin, the expectations are so high when you come in as a first overall pick that you're going to come in and really just save the blue line. And he hasn't been up to that. And it's a huge lift. It's tough to play super well for the Buffalo Sabres. I'm sorry, but it is. But the questions that have always kind of been there about his defensive game don't seem to be getting answered in a positive way. Like, it just does not seem like he's that great a defensive defenseman. And I think, we see this a lot with very talented young defensemen who come into the league and who maybe aren't as good defensively. I hate to buy into the old hockey man stereotype, but it does seem like the kind of thing that not everyone gets right away. Whereas you can get picked quite highly as a defenseman based on your flashy offense. Your skating, your power play points. So I don't think Rasmus Dahlin is a write-off by any means. No one on this list ever should be because they're so young. But I think that almost everyone's expectations of him are down from what they were when he was drafted. They just have to be.
Yeah. I think, the truly elite players to some extent can kind of transcend usage and transcend their situation, right? And as you alluded to, that's what you hope for when you pick someone number one overall. That they can transcend their situation, that they can be the rising tide that lifts all the other boats.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. If you have to constantly say, well, we're not optimizing his usage this way and that way and the other way, and it's like, okay, yes, that I can understand that maybe you're not using him as well as he possibly could be used, but at some point this guy's supposed to be the sun around which your team orbits, right? You don't hear the sun complaining about, I'm not in the wrong place in the galaxy or whatever. Like, the sun just does its thing.
Right.
I assume that's what the suns do.
This is a science lecture now, and yes, the sun does its thing. But, I agree. Sometimes you just want a player to come in and make a big impact, because that is the first overall expectation. There have to be players who can simply drive the bus, and Dahlin hasn't done that to the extent that we would hope. His play has come and gone. Again, this was a ghastly year in Buffalo for a lot of players, especially early, when they had that interminable losing streak under Ralph Kruger. And Kruger, the shine wore off him pretty hard by the end of his tenure. So, maybe things will look better under Dom Granato. Maybe they won't. I don't anticipate Buffalo's going to be that good next year, but there's certainly room for progress. It's just a question of, I don't think that Dahlin is going to be the do-everything superstar that was hoped for. And that Buffalo really needs him to be, because they need more really good players. So, yeah, his arc will be interesting to watch. I won't rule out him figuring it out and turning into some facsimile of what he was supposed to be, but I wouldn't bet on it now.
Yeah. So with all that said, let's actually get onto the list.
Right. In 10th.
So, yes.
Cole
In 10th we have...
Yeah.
Of the Montreal Canadiens. So, yeah, I mean, Caulfield is getting a lot of hype, justifiably so right now, as, part of a Habs team that is hopefully losing Game 4 of the Cup final as we record this, or at least will be in a few hours. So, yeah, I mean, Caulfield has gotten a lot of hype for a long time. He was seen in many ways as the Alex DeBrincat of his draft class, where with the advantage of having been born after Alex DeBrincat, so there was like a very obvious recent example of, hey, here's this really small guy who scored a lot in junior and also still scores a lot.
Right. And I think, the size gets overplayed in a lot of ways. It has to be said, though, there are very few NHL players who are 5'7". That's not just short, that's real short. And you factor into the fact that generally listed player heights are lies. He's a small guy. And, he looks it. That's okay. The league is different, and small players have always played more than people realized. But he is definitely one of the smallest players in the NHL, and I think that that's a factor. Now, the other thing is that he's a terrific goal scorer. Has been at every level he's played at.
Yep, and goal scoring is the single most valuable thing you can do in hockey.
Yeah.
Right? So this is a very, very strong base to build from. Now, Caulfield's NHL track record in the regular season is very small because he barely played this year. He has a much longer playoff track record, funnily enough. And he's been good in the playoffs. He's been very good in the playoffs, and he's very useful to a team like Montreal, specifically because he is one guy who can take some of that territorial dominance and turn it into goals. Mm-hmm. So I'm quite high on Caulfield. I think he's good. I think he at the moment he looks like a player whose shooting will absolutely translate, and already has at high levels of the game. His overall play is not amazing yet. I don't expect it to be. But it's good enough, and he's going to be put in a good situation in Montreal where he's not going to be relied on to be the two-way force on a line, right? He can focus on basically just scoring goals. The other thing is he might. I think one of the downsides of Montreal having no elite forwards is that they found it very easy to default into building a power play around defensemen, right? No elite offensive forwards, I should say, or no elite kind of talent forwards. Brendan Gallagher and Philip Noah are elite in their own ways, but it's not with their hands and skill with the puck. So I think one thing that Caulfield can be helpful with is kind of forcing the Habs to build a power play that is that belongs to 2020 as opposed to 1980.
Yeah, and I think that that's certainly valid. He's a great fit for them, as we've said, because lots of possession on that team. Not a lot of finishing talent, especially when you get past, Tyler Toffoli. Cole Caulfield can add goals, can add finishing. He is going to be a good NHL player. Full stop. I don't have a ton of doubt about that. The question for me about him is, what else is he going to add to his toolkit? Is he just going to be a guy who's a really good sniper and gets into good spots and finishes well and scores 30 goals a year? Which is still really good, even if that's all he is. Or is he going to add elements that flesh out his game and make him really, really, really good? Make him elite? I don't know. I find it interesting that he's scored more goals than he's had assists, seemingly everywhere he's been since 2017. At every level. He's just a finisher, par excellence. And that's fine, especially when you score goals in bunches. But it does make me wonder, is there a strong playmaking element that's going to play well at the NHL level? Does his size make him ineffective defensively, or is he still able to contribute in that regard? And there are examples of smaller players that are effective in this way. Mitch Marner, for all that everyone in Toronto hates him now, is a good defensive winger despite not being very big, but he is bigger than Caulfield. I'm talking about his size, which is probably unfair. I'm being an old hockey man, but I do think when you're giving up 3-4 inches in height and a considerable amount of weight against other players, that makes it tougher. You do lose puck battles that you would win if you were bigger. I think that that's just inevitable. It's not fatal, but I do wonder where the ceiling is. You can probably tell from the way that I'm talking about it. I actually ranked Caulfield just out of my top 10. Is this anti-Habs bias? Yes. But still, yeah, so I do. Yeah.
The reason I'm, I guess, higher on Caulfield is that, so I think the obvious kind of downside when you have the all he does is score type is Patrick Laine, right? Where Laine's star has fallen tremendously over the years, because his goal scoring needed to be elite to justify his place in the lineup because he's really bad at everything else. With Caulfield, I'm not convinced he's ever going to be a great playmaker or a great play driver, but I think he could be average at those things. And if you're average at those things and also have an elite shot, that makes you a really, really valuable player.
Yeah. And right? You could absolutely have a career, even if he doesn't get to average in those respects. Look at Mike Hoffman. But, yeah. No, I mean, the question is just where is the ceiling on him? And it's possible I'm talking myself into it being lower than it is because I do not want him to be all that successful as long as he's a Montreal Canadian. But he's going to be good. And he's the kind of player they needed, for sure.
Yeah, I had him at 8 on my list.
Yeah, I had him 12. So, yeah, but I think, there's someone on Twitter who likes the quote saying, when draft time comes around, pick the little guy who fills the fucking net. And Caulfield is the embodiment of why that's a good idea sometimes. Ultimately, he's very good at the most important thing. He's already doing it on, the biggest stage that there is, the Stanley Cup playoffs. So, yeah, I mean, the only question is how high he's going to fly. But he's going to be good.
Mm-hmm. So, do you want to do your announcer voice for the other 9 people, too, as we go, or...
Oh, well, now that I've broken out the announcer voice, I can't... someone described me as having, what was it? A teenage boy at a minimum wage job voice, listening to this podcast. I enjoyed that.
Like the guy from The Simpsons?
Yeah, like, and his voice keeps cracking. So, yeah I'm going to fight back against that perception. At number 9, it's Dylan Cousins, center for the Buffalo Sabres. God, that's...
we should also mention age when we go through each of these people. So Caulfield is 20 right now, and Dylan Cousins is also 20. I think they're like about a month apart in age. Mm-hmm. And yeah, this was another thing we should say. The line between people at this end of the list is really, really small. Like even between, Caulfield and Höglander, Stützle, Zegras, like that's not a huge difference. And with Caulfield and Cousins, the difference was half a ranking point between the two. So basically, if either one of us had ranked Caulfield one position higher or Cousins one position lower, they would have tied, basically. So yeah, Dylan Cousins of the Buffalo Sabres. Now, you chatted to Sabres Kevin about him, so maybe we should kind of lead with that,
right?
Because he's much more familiar with Cousins' game than either of us are.
Yes, Kevin was kind enough to give me an extended quote, and he said, his size-speed combo is obvious when you watch him, and over the course of the season he flashed a bit of playmaking. He is not as overly flashy as other players from his class, and that might hold back perception of him as a higher ceiling player, but I'm confident that in a neutral environment, he's the type of player who will offer as much or more actual value as his flashier counterparts. And he's talked more about the environment in Buffalo and how difficult it is for players to come along. We just talked about it with Rasmus Dahlin. But it's hard being relied on in a big role for a team that sucks butt. And the Sabres have for a long time. And so they're asking a lot of Cousins. If Jack Eichel gets traded, they're going to ask more of him still because he's probably going to be the de facto first-line center. Our managing editor, Katya, has a line about players to kind of sum them up. And she likes to say, okay, can he play hockey, though? And that's a simplified way of saying it's not just that he has standout skills or whatever. Can he actually translate those into an effective level of play? And the stats on Cousins are not that dazzling yet. But watching him, and from what Kevin has said, I feel like Cousins is the kind of guy who plays hockey. He's just good at a lot of things. He's big, he's got some skating, he's got some power forward potential, and he just does enough things well that he'll string together good plays on a consistent basis, despite not having a standout skill like Caulfield's shot.
Yeah, I mean, on a stats basis, it's frankly quite difficult to make an argument for Cousins over Zegras. Sorry, not Zegras. I was thinking about Zegras as kind of an analog, as someone else to compare to these players to, because they're all from the same draft class, I believe. Mm-hmm. There's not much of a comparison between Caulfield and Cousins in terms of stats. Like Caulfield's, especially with what he's done in the playoffs, looks better, and he's impacted things a lot more. Because a shot is one of those things that is like maybe the most, if you have an elite shot, that's maybe the most translatable skill from junior to pros.
It has a way of showing up, right? You can beat goalies and you can't. Yeah.
Yeah, like goaltenders are better, obviously. So you'll beat them less often, but if you have a great shot, you're still going to beat them sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I think with Cousins, I ranked him a little bit below Caulfield. You ranked him a little bit above Caulfield. I think Cousins is good. From what I've seen of him, yeah, he's kind of one of those guys who I think at various points in his career will get underrated for kind of the thing that Kevin mentioned. There's not an identifiable thing that he does, right? He doesn't have that signature skill. And maybe that prevents him from getting to really the top of the top in terms of elite. players, but he is just very, very good at, as you say, playing hockey. He just does the right thing a lot. And he's also, in an absolutely brutal situation last year where the team around him was, dog shit, frankly. Apart from a little bit of time with Taylor Hall and the husk of Eric Stahl, his most common line mates are Anders Bjork, who is like a fourth liner, I think, on the Bruins at some point, and Arttu Ruotsalainen, who I don't know of at all.
Yeah, like, the one thing you have to say is that pretty much nobody on the Sabres is getting carried. The only guy who was doing that to any extent was Jack Eichel, and Jack Eichel missed most of this year with an injury. So Cousins is playing on hard, for sure. And I have to admit, I was just impressed with his highlight reel in terms of he would just conduct plays by himself. There's actually one that was a disallowed goal due to an offside, but Kevin sent it to me. And it's like a one-man army rush on his part, and it's really impressive. And I just look at that, and I think this guy will probably figure it out. I do have somewhat mixed feelings about his shot, because he looked to me a little bit like he kind of slings it, and it was effective, and he placed it well, but it also wasn't the fastest release. I don't know if that's something that's borne out, if I just caught, a bad sample, but it would be something that I would keep an eye on, because generally to beat NHL goalies, first and foremost, you want a quick release now.
Yeah, but, and I mentioned Zegras before, and Zegras is another guy, another center, much more of a pass-first player as well, Trevor Zegras. Like, he's known as really a playmaker. So the comparison between them is also kind of interesting in how you view Zegras' playmaking versus Cousins, potentially higher upside as a two-way and physical player with his increased size. We ranked Cousins higher, but I think Zegras, maybe it might have been a guy we actually underrated through the rankings as well. But with Cousins, it is definitely a little bit tricky to evaluate in a team like Buffalo, because one of the other things is, I don't think the East was an incredibly strong division, but that's in part because of teams like Buffalo, right? And then Cousins never gets to play them, right? So he has to play, generally pretty strong teams, and that makes a difference as well. The one thing I'd like to see a little bit more from him, just kind of from the stats, is I want him to shoot more, right? I often use that as like a proxy for how well someone is involved in a play, and in offensive play in particular. Because players typically, with some exceptions, they only really shoot when they think it's a good play to, right? Very few players actually game shooting from everywhere. And we'll talk about one of them later. So, his shot rate is a little bit low. And maybe that's, a little bit of a worry, but I was impressed with generally how he looked on an otherwise really, really poor Buffalo team with, frankly, no talent around him, being asked, as the year progressed, to do, I think, some pretty difficult things.
Yeah. And so we're hoping to see better stats from him going forward.
Yeah.
But we're giving him a lot of credit for his situation and for his visual skills.
I mean, with basically all of these guys who are, at this low end of the list, we're looking at guys who have really limited NHL track records, and neither Fulman nor I are scouts. So we're kind of combining what we saw of scouting reports before they were drafted and, their less than one season NHL stat lines, which we put some stock into, but not an enormous amount, because it's one season in the NHL in essentially closed environments based on division.
Yeah. I mean, the stats this year, I have no idea how they're going to mature, or whether we're going to end up looking at them all as insane aberrations. It could be a pretty crazy season statistically, as it turns out. I mean, it was in McDavid's point totals, if nothing else. But
yes.
Yeah. Are we ready to move to number 8?
Yep, let's do it.
Number 8, Alexis Lafreniere, left wing for the New York Rangers.
Lafreniere is 19 years old. Obviously, was the first overall pick in the 2020 NHL draft. Was in the NHL this year. Was not amazing, right? And it's like that's okay. That's not a huge issue.
Right. When we talk about how hard it is to play in the NHL as a teenager, this is who I'm thinking of. And I saw a lot of tweets and people were saying, oh my god, this guy was a disaster, a bust. He's not a real first overall pick of any caliber. And it's like, you gotta just chill a little bit. The vast majority of players are not Austin Matthews their first year. Like, that was just an extraordinary rookie season of the kind that you rarely see. Alexis Lafreniere had 1 goal in his first 15 games and 11 in his last 41. Now, normally I hate the endpoints game that this implies, where I just cut it to make him look better. But the first 15 games there that I'm describing were the first 15 of his NHL career. So I think expecting some growth as the year went on is reasonable. If nothing else, though, his hands are absurd, man. Like, you look at his highlight reel, and within 3 seconds you're like, oh, no, I get it. That's why.
And, yeah, that was already on display. I think the way he looked on the whole was kind of the way you expect really talented 18-year-olds to look generally, which is they struggle to drive play because they're not physically developed. The game is just much faster. They're not thinking at the level of NHLers quite yet, or not all the time. But when they get the puck on their stick in dangerous situations, it's still the same stick, it's still the same puck. They can still do crazy things with it. Mm. Right? And that's exactly what we saw. Like, he finished at a very impressive rate. That's really good to see. Right? That flashes that high-end puck skill that, justifies ranking him, or taking him number 1 overall. And he was, not amazing at driving play, but again, that's fine. That's going to come with time. He was... The other thing is, I do follow some Rangers fans, and they were not entirely happy with how he was used at times. I think it took quite a while before he was given like a consistent run of line mates. He was kind of bounced up and down a lot, and that can have an impact for sure when it comes to a young player trying to find their feet in a very kind of weird situation in the NHL.
Yeah, it's worth noting his new head coach, who was just hired, is going to be Gerard Galland, who is widely considered an excellent coach, maybe with a bit of a skew towards veterans, but we'll see. I'm sure that in hiring him, one of the top questions was, what are you going to do with our young players like Kakko and Lafreniere? That has to be a huge priority for the Rangers organization. So, I have very little doubt that Lafreniere is going to be a first-line player. I just do not believe that any one of his abilities is going to miss.
Yes, and I mean, the age thing is, again, very important, right? Like, Hoglander almost certainly had a better year than Lafreniere. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, not almost certainly, he did. Yeah. Right? But he's also a year and a half older at an age where that makes a really significant difference.
Yeah. It's huge, and it goes a long way. And if there were one thing that really impacted me watching his highlights, something that really stood out to me, is he took a pass from the corner from Artemi Panarin, of all people, and he did this little forehand-backhand shuffle to beat the goalie around the pad and then tucked the puck in. And he did this while being cross-checked into the ice. Sidebar. It's insane that the league doesn't call cross-checking better. Okay, whatever. But being able to operate and keep ahead enough to finish that play while getting knocked down, I think that that's a very positive little play. That speaks to his presence of mind and his ability to keep operating under pressure, because that's a huge portion of what hockey is about. If you're an offensive player, is the ability to keep doing what you can do when you're getting hit, when you're getting defended very aggressively. Lots of guys are good in an empty rink. Lafreniere, I think there are already signs that he's good on a crowded one, and I think he's only going to get better. So I remain high on Lafreniere.
Yeah, no, I think he's going to be good. Especially, if his shooting talent is real and he's able to increase the amount of shots he takes, that can be hugely valuable, because he's not a huge shot guy right now. He doesn't take that many. Right? And, it remains to be seen. I didn't watch him closely enough to know if he's Bozacking it, but given his reputation of being a really high-skilled player, I doubt that's the case. I think, he just struggled at least at first to get to the spots that he needs to get to, but then when he's there, he's able to convert.
Right.
And as he gets more comfortable, when he's more able to get to those spots, I'm, really positive that he's going to be a very good player for a very long time. And, in a world where if we ever, have international best on bests again, he's probably going to make a Team Canada at some point. especially because he plays left wing, which is historically a weaker position.
So, yeah, lots to recommend him there. And mostly that's just... I'm just reacting here to the number of people I saw who kind of lost patience with him immediately. And I think that was really premature.
Yeah.
Are we ready for number 7?
Yes, we are.
Well, number 7, Jason Robertson, left winger for the Dallas Stars. And he is 21.
He is. So it's worth noting that Robertson and Lafreniere were separated by, again, half a point. So, a change in ranking for either one of us of the amount of 1 point or 1 spot would have made them tie. Robertson is, we talked about him on one of our awards podcasts. What he's done in terms of being a genuinely productive, good, all-round player at age, 20, 21. Very, 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 very impressive. Very impressive.
Yeah, he's a great sniper. He's big, much bigger than his brother, as we've mentioned. Finished a lot of plays for Dallas. My only question, and I raised this in the awards podcast, is I kind of wondered from what I saw if he was the straw stirring the drink, so to speak. If...
Right, because he did play with Rupe Hintz, who also had one of those, bonkers years where you look back, 5 years from now, and you're like, whoa, Rupe Hintz had a year where he was, the 10th best skater in the world? What the hell?
Yeah, and Joe Pavelski, who
Joe
has
Pavelski
aged
as well.
Unbelievably well. And so...
I just want to point out, the one guy... The one old guy the Stars didn't re-sign is the one that's... Or not the Stars, the Sharks didn't re-sign. Is the one that's aging well.
Yeah, and everyone else, they were like, let's give them 8 years. It'll be fine. Woof. Anyway, yeah, so I do wonder a little bit how that'll translate. And Dallas has a bit of an overhanging issue in that most of their best forwards are old. Pavelski, Seguin, Ben... so that might be a concern for them for a team building perspective. But as long as they can put people with Robertson who get him the puck a lot, I think that he will figure out what to do with it.
Yes.
Not a lot of doubt there.
Yeah, he, very good shot. Something that we hope that Nick Robertson will also do. Kind of dog it on puck retreat. As you mentioned, he is bigger than Nick Robertson. I've noticed a lot of these fans kind of assuming they must, which is not an awful assumption if you don't know that. Okay, Nick Robertson is small. His brother's probably not huge, but yeah, he's huge. He's much bigger.
Yeah, Nick Robertson was born prematurely, obviously.
Yes.
And so he's 5'9". His brother is a full 6 inches taller. So.
Yes. One of the big things that made me like Jason Robertson, or made me kind of really be quite a bit of a believer in him, is that by the end of the year, he was he's being played like a first liner. He earned the coach's trust. That's hard to do for someone that age.
Right.
So I think it says something, right? The Stars coaching staff actually really see something in him. That they think, okay, this isn't just some rookie who we have to protect. We're just going to use him, not kind of agnostic of the fact that he's a young player. We're just treating him like he's a veteran, right?
Yeah, and that means they believe he's one of their best players. And
yeah,
right.
And I don't think Rick Bowness has any particular reputation one way or the other for overplaying or underplaying rookies. I think he's probably a standard coach in that sense, which means he's probably a little bit risk averse. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think if he trusts Robertson, that's a good indicator that he's doing the little things right, because those are the things that coaches hate, and what often frustrates fans is a young player will do most things well and clearly be a net benefit to the team, but the 15% of things that he does poorly are the things that coaches kind of overweight.
Yeah. I mean, look
right?
at Caulfield. He was scratched the first 2 games of the Leafs-Habs series, which looks insane.
It is insane. Well, while we're here,
yeah.
why is Thomas Tatar not playing? we did it a podcast. We're like, man, that Tatar, Gallagher, Dano line, that's going to be tough. And then Tatar just never played.
It's... Okay. Little aside here. We tried not to talk about the Habs. The Habs legitimately were impressive. And we were always high on them. They've exceeded my expectations. No question. But also, a huge portion of this was a massive goalie run. It just was. And you can say it's Carey Price. He should be expected to produce more goalie runs than the average Bear. That's fair. They are paying him for that. And, he has delivered. But, I think when you make the finals, and especially if you win the cup, but when you make the finals, a kind of, magic fairy dust gets sprinkled over every decision, every player acquisition, everything you've done, because it's well, they were part of a very successful playoff team. It must have been the right decision. But I think the Habs have done a lot of things, and Ducharme has done a lot of things, that are a little bit iffy, and that Carey Price was covering for.
If the Leafs win that Game 6, that decision to bench Tatar, because Tatar played the first 5 games, I believe. I haven't looked this up, but I think he got benched for Game 6, which is somewhat unusual, because normally lineups are unchanged after wins. But if the Habs lose that Game 6 or that Game 7 without Tatar playing, there's a huge amount of furor about that move. And it's weird that they haven't played Tatar. He's good. He's a good player. I recognize that he's not always amazing defensively, and again, coaches can overweight that. And I guess you can't say it's necessarily hurt Montreal that much, but it's still something that I find odd. The process is still odd to me, despite the results looking fine.
I think you could absolutely argue it's hurt Montreal. The Deneau has one goal in 20 games in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying, he probably misses Tatar, who is one of their better playmaking wingers, say what you will. But anyway.
Yeah.
I will not torture myself about this anymore. But yeah, so I think Robertson is going to be an impressive player for the Stars for some time to come. I think they have some questions, and they have to be considering who they're going to play him with. But maybe it is just Rupe Hens, and then that's going to be fine. Mm-hmm. But very impressive all around player with some nice finishing. Are you ready for number 6?
Yeah, so actually before you give your pro wrestling introducer voice again, we should mention that from here on out, the top 6 players are now we're getting to the realm of players who have multiple years track record in the NHL. Mm-hmm. Right, so these are players who we've seen more, and spoiler alert, a lot of them are from the Atlantic. So or at least a couple of them are from the Atlantic or from the Canadian division. Mm-hmm. So we've seen these guys quite a bit more, and now we can be a bit more confident in what these people are. So, just wanted to kind of give that as context and go ahead.
Number 6, from the Ottawa Senators at left wing, it's Brady Tkachuk. And Brady Tkachuk is 21. As mentioned, more established. I think that there's a big question hanging over everything about evaluating Brady Tkachuk, and we mentioned it last year when he made this list, and now it's again. Will he ever finish at an average or even just a little below average rate? Or is he doomed to be constantly forcing shots that don't go in? Because if you look at his stat profile, it looks like he is generating a McDavid caliber level of offensive chances. And he is finishing on them unbelievably poorly. The discrepancy there is crazy.
Yeah, and at a certain point, where this has been the case for basically 2 of his 3 years in the NHL, where his offensive play driving looks among the best in the league, and then his finishing looks among the worst in the league. At this point, I don't think we can take that at face value and honestly say, I think Brady Tkachuk is the best offensive play driver in the league, but also shoots like Colton Orr.
Yeah, it's just
there's very obviously something going on here with respect to how his shots are counted. With respect to his decision making in terms of when he's putting the puck on net, from the angles he's putting the puck on net. Is he just hacking away 5 times into a goalie's pad, and those are all being recorded as 5 different shots, which have in reality a 0% chance to go in, or a very close to 0% chance to go in. But by XG models, because when players take shots from really close and tight, they historically have a very good probability of going in, due to where the goalie's positioned and whatnot. It looks like he's massively underperforming XG, whereas the reality might be XG is overrating those chances because it can't see that he's just stuffing pucks into pads from an angle of 0 degrees.
Mm-hmm. And so, I think go ahead.
No, I mean, I guess it's a really interesting question as to what precisely is happening here. Mike McCurdy has these really useful kind of finishing breakdowns, where it breaks out finishing and scoring touch, more or less, from across different shot types. And the thing with Brady Tkachuk, at least last year, he was about league average on tips/deflections, which is kind of what you would expect. My thinking is that for the most part, one tip from one player is similar to another tip from another player. It's just what distinguishes players is how often they get those tips. Maybe that's a flawed assumption, but I would expect like the distribution of finishing on tips/deflections to be quite tight. And Kachuk's in line with that. Tkachuk literally never takes slap shots. He took 5 of them this year. He takes a few backhands, finishes on them poorly. They're all from really close and tight. And then the wrist and snap shots are really where he, and for most players, the bulk of the shots he takes. He has a little hot finishing spot at the top of the right circle, which makes sense, because he does have some skill. And then everywhere else, it's ice cold. And the pattern of the backhand and wrist shot finishing, to me, suggests that he is shoveling pucks to the net indiscriminately. And yeah, like it's kind of it's stat padding in a sense, or it's like analytics padding. It is a little bit ironic that Brady Tkachuk, this tough, hard-nosed player, might be the guy who's quote-unquote gaming analytics, which is something that, I think old-timey sports writers have implied is something that, skill perimeter players would do.
Yeah, well, I mean, the main use of that argument is to condemn players they don't like who have good analytics and be like, well, they're just, gaming it to their benefit. Whereas Brady Tkachuk is gaming it in the most old-school hockey way of all time, by going to the dirty areas of the ice and hacking and slashing until hopefully something bounces in.
And most of the time it doesn't.
And so that's a really significant point in evaluating Brady Tkachuk. Because, we're spending a lot of time on his towering flaw. Because he's very good at a lot of things. He's big. He is a nasty son of a bitch. He is good at drawing penalties. He's a massive net positive in offensive chances. He's still a good player, even if this is just how it is. Like, it's fine. He's a 50-point power forward type who is going to piss everybody off and who will, get a decent number of points and goals per year. And, hacking and slashing the puck into the net isn't the worst thing in the world if it goes in a certain percentage of the time. It's just, if he can learn to finish, if he can be a little bit more effective, that changes his trajectory immensely because so much is already there. And so the question is this something that he can fix? Or is it, as we've been saying, we kind of suspect, to some extent part and parcel of getting all the shots that he does is that they're bad? And that if he improves them, by definition, he's going to get fewer of them. Because you can't get this many good shots.
Yeah, that's kind of my thinking at this point, where he just... Yeah, and when you watch him, it kind of bears it out, where he gets his stick on so many things that people otherwise wouldn't be able to, but he's like off balance, doing it between his legs, his looking out of the ear hole of his helmet, right? They're not high quality shots. It's not necessarily things that he's taking off the table necessarily, right? It's not like there's much better options who he's looking off in order to force bad shots. I think most of these are like hustle plays that just end up having low value and are not that common in hockey, so they get they fool XG models into thinking they're much higher value than they are, because those models can't necessarily see his positioning or the puck or the goaltender's positioning or how on or off balance he is, or all those things like that. But as of right now, I certainly expect him to be a guy whose goals impact is always going to be much less than his expected goals impact, at least offensively, for exactly this reason. Now, it's one of the other things worth noting. Ottawa has, over the course of his time, they've been a pretty dog shit team. And one of the things with Tkachuk is, to me, it's a little bit unclear how he's going to scale with better and better line mates.
I've been wondering that too, yeah.
He's not a phenomenal passer. And, in some sense, he doesn't need to be. He's decent enough at it. And him being like a human kind of trash collector in front, maybe you pair a passer with him and just say, okay, this guy's going to set you up in front and give you more high value chances in front. Maybe that'll be enough. But we haven't seen him play with someone really all that great yet. He didn't play at all with Stützle this year, which makes sense because Stützle again wasn't very good this year, and Tkachuk is probably the Senators' best forward. He played with Josh Norris and Drake Batherson, who are good, and Connor Brown, who's okay. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure how well his game will translate, or how well it'll evolve and work with other high-end players if Ottawa gets them.
Yeah, I would bet probably on it scaling well rather than the reverse. I could be wrong, but I think that it can only be to his benefit to play with better players than Josh Norris and Connor Brown.
Norris is good, by the way. Like he maybe should have made the outer fringes of this list, right? Like he played pretty difficult minutes on Ottawa, had a positive play driving impact, and finished well.
Yeah, I mean, to his credit for that, for sure. But I do think that Tkachuk would be a great complementary player for players like Stützle projects to be. If you're asking who would I love to have at left wing with Matthews and Marner, Brady Tkachuk. I would adore that idea. Now, I wouldn't be perfect. As you said, he maybe wouldn't be the best passer, but someone who just goes to the crease and causes absolute chaos to the best of his ability, I would enjoy that very much. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops as the Senators lineup improves and matures and puts better talent with him. Either way, he's going to be a good power forward, but is he going to be just, like a good player with flaws? Or is there more to be gained there if he starts finishing on these chances and then he starts looking like a really dominant player?
Yeah. Like with these players now, like the question is, we know everyone who we're talking about on the list at this point is like an upper end of the lineup player. The question is, can they become an elite player, essentially?
Right.
If they're not there already. I just looked this up. Norris actually is ineligible for this because he turned 22 in May.
Oh, how dare he! So
yeah, so that's good. That means Ottawa fans, if they listen to this, can't yell at us.
Yeah. As opposed to like 100 other things I'm sure we got wrong about Senators. But hey.
Yes.
Number 5. Coming in at 5th, Nick Suzuki, center for the Montreal Canadiens.
Right. So
yeah,
I've mentioned this a few times before. Yes, he's 21. I've mentioned this a few times before. Nick Suzuki has put me in the position of having to argue against a player who I actually quite like, because I think he is very good, and nonetheless Montreal fans overrate him. That said, we're not talking about the reaction to the reaction here, so let's just talk about Nick Suzuki, the player, because he's really neat. He's a very good player.
Yeah. Nick Suzuki is just a very creative player, and it jumps off the screen at you when you're watching the Montreal Canadiens, who, for a long time, did not have all that many super creative offensive players. It really stood out to me on the power play. I remember, and this was season before this one, and the first unit was like the most moribund thing that night. Like, it just looked awful. It was just Shea Weber point shots and stuff. And then they put the second unit out, and it was the Nick Suzuki show, and it was way better. And I was like, they should do that all the time. I think he's just a very smart player. He's a bit undersized, he's not tiny or anything, but he's not huge, and he's not like the fastest skater you've ever seen, but he's just a smart, creative player.
Yeah. We've mentioned the lack of kind of elite movement and skating before, and I think that does kind of hamper his upside to some degree. He doesn't have that gear where he can go around people, right? And I don't mean that in he doesn't have that McDavid gear, because no one has that McDavid gear. But he doesn't even have notably above average top end speed from what I've seen. Mm-hmm. What he's good at is kind of dictating the pace through the rest of his game, right? Through his head movements, through the way he sets up plays, through his passing. He's a very complete offensive player aside from that kind of physical tool. And in a lot of ways, he reminds me a bit of William Nylander. Mm. I think that's like a reasonable comparable for him, right? They've put up kind of somewhat similar point totals. They have somewhat similar net play driving effects, although Nylander's is tilted more towards producing offense, and Suzuki appears to be better defensively at the same age, significantly better defensively. I wonder if some of that is also the systems in which they're in, right?
I suspect
kind of
but that's
taking on the personality of the team around them to some extent, right? Where the Leafs, certainly in Nylander's formative years, were all offense, no defense, and the Habs are a bit of the reverse and have actually a really robust system for young players to kind of be introduced into. Now, to his credit, I mentioned this with Robertson, and it's important here. Suzuki was essentially Montreal's most played player, or forward at least, through most of the year. Right? He has earned the trust of both Claude Julien and Dom Ducharme. That says something. That's valuable. And yeah, I think his net effect is kind of going to be on the same end of William Nylander. As mentioned, they do it in different ways. Suzuki more through controlling the pace of game, and Nylander more with kind of the constant barrage of offense from different angles and different plays. Right? I think Nylander's more dynamic offensively and with the puck on his stick for sure. But Suzuki has a lot going for him, and the way he thinks the game is really the fundamental reason why he is as good as he is.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that Suzuki is very well suited to be the guy on a team that looks like it's overachieving. I think he's the best offensive player on Montreal, full stop, already. And I think that he stands out on a team that doesn't have a lot of offensive firepower of his caliber. He's not like a gold-plated star, as we've said. He doesn't have some miraculous standout skill that's going to really elevate him into the Matthews-McKinnon kind of tier. And that's okay. He's still going to be very, very good. But I think Montreal is probably going to, at some point, have to confront some questions about building around him. They can still be an excellent team where Suzuki is the best forward. I'm just saying that the ceiling is probably a little lower than if they had a superstar. But he's as good as you can be in the next year down, I feel like.
Yeah, again, this is the kind of the William Nylander thing, right? Not to turn everything to something but the least, but it's useful contextually where, if William Nylander is your best forward, that's probably, that your upside is limited. Now, I mean, we say that. What we mean, whenever we say, anything absolute, we mean, within most universes, right? There's always the chance things happen. As you said, Suzuki is arguably one of the Habs' best offensive forwards, and it doesn't look like they're going to win the cup, but they got damn close.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I think it's worth bearing that in mind. They've got relatively far with a very young Nick Suzuki as is. But yes, I do agree that, generally speaking, he's not the archetypal number one center on a conventionally constructed NHL top-end contender.
Yeah.
That
put it this
doesn't
way,
mean
I don't
he
think
can't
he's ever
be
going to get
incredibly
90
useful.
points.
No, I don't think so either. But he's a very, very useful player to have. Does a lot of things well. I think another thing is he seems to fit well with a lot of different players. And it's also worth noting, he doesn't have, crazy elite offensive line mates with him either. He played a bit with, I think, Drouin and Anderson, and then Toffoli and Armia. Toffoli and Anderson are good players, right? And the line with Armia, Toffoli, and Suzuki, I think, worked pretty well for portions of the year. Maybe it struggled a bit towards in April when the Habs kind of fell off a cliff entirely. But yeah, I think Suzuki is going to be a very good player for a very long time. He does kind of fit in that Montreal kind of standard thing, which has been the case almost as long as I've been alive, where, like the Leafs until recently, they don't have that elite league-bending talent. Mm-hmm. The way and the Leafs didn't have that for a long time either, and only recently have got it with Matthews and Marner. Mm-hmm. I don't think Suzuki is going to change that for the Habs, but you're incredibly thrilled if you can have him on your second line. Like that is you're stacked if Nick Suzuki's on your second line, at least at forward. Yeah,
I remember I was saying beforehand that if you could just airdrop a first line center in front of all of them, and they tried with the Sebastian Aho offer sheet, the Habs look really good all of a sudden. And the Habs have looked good in these playoffs without that. But just imagining this team with Deneau as a pure third line center type, with Suzuki at second line, and then with another star on top, then I think that they're at least giving Tampa a run. And, you know, they're a very interesting team as a consequence. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like I might be damning him with faint praise, and that's not really what I want to do, because I really do believe that he's an exceptional player. And Montreal is probably not unhappy that he's their best one, even if he's not one of the very best in the NHL. Ready to move on?
I think so, yeah. Nothing else I wanted to say about Suzuki. Oh, sorry. No, there was one thing I wanted to say about Nick Suzuki.
Okay.
So, you know, we just lavished a lot of praise on a Habs player, which, believe me, does not please either of us. But, you know, there were earnest tweets from, like, respected sports writers this year who were going like, you know, Nick Suzuki's really reminding me of a young Patrice Bergeron. And this was during Suzuki's, you know, hot streak to start the year, where he, you know, had an on-ice shooting percentage of a bajillion or something like that. Yeah, look, don't compare him to Patrice Bergeron.
Maybe don't compare anyone to Patrice Bergeron.
No,
like he might be the best defensive player of all time.
Yeah, and also Patrice Bergeron put up 73 points at age 20, and then followed up with 70 points at age 21. Like,
oh man,
you know, we pigeonhole Patrice Bergeron into like, oh yeah, he's been he's one of the best defensive centers ever, which is true. He's a really good offensive center as well, right? And his point totals actually never caught up to that afterwards. I think in part because of power play usage, but like his even strength points have always been very good, Bergeron. So I feel like every 3 or 4 podcasts we just go on a rant about how people still don't fully appreciate Patrice Bergeron, and this is no doubt informed by him kicking our ass in like 3 separate playoff series.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's really, really, really good. Stop comparing people to Patrice Bergeron.
Yeah, I mean this very sincerely. The Pasternak, Marchand, Bergeron line is the best line in the NHL still, in my opinion. The Marchand, Bergeron, Crosby line is the best line I have ever seen exist in any kind of competitive hockey game. From the World Cup of Hockey in 2016, they were stupid good. Anyway, I'm mad about this.
No, it was. I mean, I was like half rooting for Canada at those events. I always find it a little bit boring to root for Canada at these international events, which I mean I usually do, but it's like, okay, I mean, you know, let's win, but this is. I hope someone gives us at least a bit of a fight, which sounds very, very egotistical because it's single elimination hockey and anything can really happen. But Canada's team is usually so stacked that they're the odds-on favorite. Watching that Bergeron, Crosby, Marchand line, it was just like, this is unfair. How do you beat this line?
I remember thinking the rest of the lineup was not actually clicking that well. And it did not matter. I was like, this line is just like, there's nothing anyone can do. It's not even like, oh yeah, they're really good. It's like, literally, what does it matter? Like, you're defending against that? Like, just retire. Anyway.
Yeah. That was a disgusting line.
Ugh. We've praised so many Habs and Bruins on this podcast. It leaves a sour taste in my mouth.
Yeah. As for sorry, this is another digression. In terms of best lines in the league right now, I mean, do you still put how much of a gap is there between that Bergeron, Marchand, Pasternak line against Rantanen, McKinnon, Landeskog?
Yeah, not much. And I knew that, like, if you're looking at the other lines, that's an obvious candidate. Yeah. And the Oilers are capable of putting together a line that contends with it with McDavid, Draisaitl, Guy. But
yeah, and if put Nugent Hopkins there in particular, like that's a very good line as well.
Yeah, even though
I don't think they did that
typically
much.
Do that. No, Draisaitl mostly played on his own this year, but
yeah, and even when they did play together, I don't think they. I mean, they're really totaling their depth if they do that. I mean, what type of coach would decide, maybe in an elimination game, but even in a regular season game, to just play 3 stars together despite never doing that for the entire year and cripple his depth against an opponent, whether they're stronger or weaker? I don't think any NHL coach would ever do that.
When you did the setup for that joke, like 4 words in, it was like me seeing an oncoming train and being like, this is going to run me over. And it just happened. It's like the pain
Still
is
not
fresh
over.
again.
Yeah.
No,
still
nor
not
will
over
we
it.
ever be. The only way we're getting over this is if the Leafs win a goddamn round, which God knows if that'll ever happen. So,
Yeah.
number 4 for the Vancouver Canucks on defense, Quinn Hughes.
And
Who-
actually, we should note that we have a tie actually for spots 3 and 4.
Right. Yes, forgive me. Tied for number 3. The defense for the Vancouver Canucks, Quinn Hughes. And yet, after maybe a mixed bag of a season for him,
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation heading into this year was like, oh, Hughes or Makar or Heiskanen, who we'll talk about, which of these young defensemen is quote unquote the best, right? And I think a lot of people were kind of debating really between Hughes and Makar. They're certainly the more offensive minded of those three. And now I think Makar is like kind of pulled clear of this discussion.
yeah.
And Hughes, after a somewhat rough year, has dropped back a bit from it.
Yeah, last year I had Hughes ahead of Makar, and I still think that team context is maybe understated in that discussion. Vancouver is atrocious, Colorado is excellent, but I think Makar has done a lot to separate
Yeah,
himself.
I mean,
and Hughes
Makar is a huge reason why they're
yeah,
so good.
that's, yeah. There's definitely a chicken and egg thing there. Like they're good partly because they have an unbelievably talented young defenseman. Quinn Hughes impresses me visually as much as any player in the NHL. Like he's just a gorgeous skater in terms of
Yeah, just an absolute savant when it comes to skating.
Yeah, like it's just like a pleasure to watch him do it. Honestly, like just a gifted player. He was also a part of probably the worst NHL defense I can remember. And I know that that's probably not true. And at some point, when the Leafs were tanking and they were playing Keith Ollie or whatever, they probably weren't even tanking when they played Ollie. They were just terrible. But the Vancouver Canucks, especially early in this year, and this is before the COVID outbreak. I'm not blaming them for anything subsequent to that, but they let players get to the crease more easily than I've ever seen an NHL defense do. And there were a lot of parties at fault for that, but it's hard for me not to be like, well, Quinn Hughes was involved. He was present.
I mean, he's their most played defenseman, right?
Yeah, so you're gonna get some of that on you if that blows up. So yeah, and now he played with Travis Hamonic, who was washed, but
and well, I mean, he also he got a much better line mate at one point in Jordy Ben, right? Like he is so much better.
That's a murderer's row.
How can Quinn Hughes complain?
This is the thing, and you can see this echoing through the whole list, where it's like, okay, but they also play for like the worst team imaginable, so how much slack do you cut them for that? And isolated stats try to, but it is still tricky. I'm so impressed with Hughes as an offensive defenseman, and his point totals were still ridiculous. But
yes.
I care less about defenseman points, and it does give me a bit of pause that he appears to have been part of a turnstile committee on defense.
Right.
Like that just
now,
let anyone through.
The interesting thing is that the stats bottles have different ways of like blaming him for it, or different kind of levels of blaming him for it. Where RAPM, which has, of course, no prior based on previous years, says, yeah, Hughes was really, really bad defensively this year. Right? Or I guess, to be more precise about it, in the context in which he was played, Hughes was associated with very, very bad defense from the Canucks. HockeyViz views Hughes as league average defensively. And in part that's based on a prior where, HockeyViz has looked at implicitly the player's career up until that moment, more or less, and decides how to allocate blame based on that. And my guess, without looking it up, is that Hamonic and Jordy Ben have ridiculously awful defensive results by HockeyViz because they're ascribing a lot of those really bad defensive results to those players. Now, one of the interesting things we saw is that the year prior Hughes played primarily with Chris Tanev, who we all thought was kind of washed. Tanev then went to Calgary and had a pretty decent year. And maybe that pairing was more symbiotic than we thought they were. Essentially, that might be my thinking. Hughes does seem to have still significant problems defensively, at least visually, and that's always he's never looked incredible visually in the first place on defense. But yeah, I'm not blaming him entirely for that disaster. He's still very, very good. He could very easily win a Norris, especially if Vancouver finds him a TJ Brody to play with effectively.
Yeah, I do feel very confident. Quinn Hughes, you want him to have a defensive defenseman partner, or at least a guy who can do that at a high level. Even better if he can play offense too. But Chris Tanev is the kind of guy that I think you want. Someone who's going to free up Hughes to just go to the offensive zone and do magic stuff and pinch when he feels so inclined and all that good stuff. And when he's paired with someone who's not capable of that, that's a problem. And I think we saw exactly how ugly it can get in the course of this year for Vancouver.
Yes, with Hughes as a defenseman, we talked about his movement. You want to leverage that movement, right? So you want to give him the freedom to go where his heart sees fit and tell him more or less, okay, look, it's not that you have no defensive responsibilities, but what makes you special is your ability to move, right? And he has great instincts when he does have the puck in the offensive zone, no matter where within the offensive zone it is. And he's not Morgan Rielly defending the rush either, right? I'd say he's a better defender than Rielly is, certainly at his age. Mm-hmm. So, a team should absolutely try and maximize what they get out of his offense, because that's the more special part of it, and he's not so bad defensively that it's undoing all the good that he creates offensively. Now, one of the things that connects it, they play him a lot with Pettersson when Pettersson was healthy. I think that's a smart decision.
Yeah, and that's something that I wanted to remark on. They should do that more than they do. They didn't do it as much as I expected this year. And I find that surprising. And I know that it's clouded by Pettersson's injury, but still, with a player of Hughes' caliber, you should be thinking, how can I put this guy in the offensive zone every single chance I get? And you should prioritize doing that. And Pettersson, same sort of thing. Put them together. It seems like a given.
Yeah, so I'm looking at HockeyViz's defenseman with forward ice time graphic that they have, which I love looking at because it's a really nice thing it's a really well-designed graphic. They have Hughes playing quite a bit with Pettersson, or quite a bit more than you would naively expect if proportional ice time between forward and defenseman were completely independent. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if that's skewed a bit due to partial games and injuries and things like that. But yeah, I agree. They absolutely, to whatever extent they are playing with Hughes with Pettersson, they should probably just keep doing that or do that more. Right?
Yeah.
You want to leverage your two elite offensive talents playing together, because those types of players are synergistic, right? They make each other better in a non-linear way.
Right. And I'm thinking of what Adam Fox was doing with Artemi Panarin this year, where he was playing tons of minutes, the two of them together, and Fox won a Norris on a not unrelated note. When I'm looking, I would say, well, Hughes has about 80 more minutes away from Pettersson than with him when they're both in the lineup. And it's just I think they have that idea in their head, but it's that should be a real priority, because what else do you have going on the Vancouver Canucks that you're prioritizing instead of this? Also
true. It's a really, really bad roster when you get past, they have 5 good players spread out between the team, and then when you get past those 5 good players, it's rough.
Yeah, it's brutal. And
well, at least they have tons of cap space.
Gee, I can believe that they kept Jim Benning, but I think it's really stupid that they kept Jim Benning. Anyway, that's their problem. So, are we ready to move to number 3, part 2?
Yes.
And coming in at number 3, part 2 for the New Jersey Devils, and brother of the foregoing, center Jack Hughes.
Yes, so the Hughes brothers are tied for number 3, which is very serendipitous. I swear we did not try and make that happen. So, Fullman, you alluded to a guy at the start of the pod who moved up a lot. Jack Hughes is that guy.
He is that guy. And this is another example of what we were talking about. He came in as an 18-year-old for the Devils, another very poor team, and he had a rough season. And everyone was like, oh, I don't know about this Jack Hughes character. And his 19-year-old season was much better. And he looks back on track. And I think he's going to be a first-line center. He, like his brother, is a great skater. And he's a great playmaker. And I think that he can be the offensive sort of focus for a lineup. You know, we talked about Suzuki as, you know, is it good enough if he's your best offensive player? Whereas I think once Hughes settles in, it will be just fine that Hughes is their best offensive player. And you know, especially they've got Nico Hischier, who's also a good young player, who can be a bit more defensive oriented. But I think that that's a really enviable 1-2 punch that they've got going there now. Really nice
It really
mix.
is. Yeah, and the thing with Hughes, with Jack Hughes, that's going to be interesting is it's kind of the McKinnon thing. If this guy learns to finish, you know, we're in trouble. Like, the league's in trouble.
Yeah, people are going to get hurt.
Both his rookie and sophomore years, his finishing was pretty right? At least overall. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of that's driven by by power play finishing. And I'd be interested to see, you know, about kind of what are the types of shots he's getting on the power play in particular, because, you know, as we know, XG can be a little bit weird on power plays because you can exert more control over the situation you're in, and as a result, you know, the player positioning matters more. XG can be missing things when it comes to the power play. But yeah, I mean, if he can convert consistently above his expected goals, which is what you expect from most players taken that high in the draft, it's going to be he's going to be a really phenomenal, really complete offensive player.
Mm-hmm. So
he's a very fun player to watch as well. I wanted to make that point. Very smooth skating, good with the puck in the neutral zone. You know, great zone entry guy, and yeah, like you can tell when you watch him. It's like, okay, yeah, this guy has like a really, really great mental map of where everyone is on the ice at all times, because there's these situations where kind of these awkward situations that don't come up that often in hockey, that sometimes he'll get himself into, that all players will get themselves into. And instinctively, he knows and makes where people are and makes good plays, even in situations where it's not necessarily like practice or something he's seen before. It's just he has an intuition and an understanding of, okay, here's the situation that I can see, and that means this is what's going to happen to the rest of the ice, and here's how I can take advantage of that. And that's really, really cool to see. That's a player archetype that I love.
Yeah, and it's wild for those of us who grew up with the Devils being a tedious, evil empire that would trap and suffocate every game to death, that they have some cool young offensive players. I have a hard time wrapping my head around that. There's actually something else that I wanted to remark on, just because it's staggering to me as someone who looks at, you know, Cat Friendly and sheets like that and the long-term outlook. And we will eventually do a team outlook pod, as we do every summer. You know, we'll look at all the teams. Do you know how many players that the Devils have signed for at least 3 years? One.
Really?
Nico Hischier.
Is it Hischier? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's it. They have 0 forwards signed that long. They have besides him. They have 0 defensemen. They have 0 goalies signed that long. They will be paying Corey Schneider's buyout for 3 seasons, but that doesn't really count. They have, like, this wide open field of cap space. Now, they're the Devils. They don't tend to be a big contender for free agents, and that also means they don't have a lot of very good players. You know, they have a ton of young RFAs right now, and they're going to have to make a bunch of decisions about them. But it's really kind of staggering how this team has basically Hischier, and then Jack Hughes, who they will hang on to, and then just like a wide open field. So as it is, they're very bad still. But it would be very interesting if you're a GM to come in, and I mean, Tom Fitzgerald is not coming in, he's been there, but like, he can do pretty much whatever he wants. He may be the most free GM in the league in some ways because he has
aside from Ron Francis, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but Francis will probably be more encumbered the day after the expansion draft than Fitzgerald will be, and I really
no, that's true.
It's just wild. So like the Devils could do anything. They could languish in the basement for years, or they could suddenly spring up.
Yeah. So just one other note. So I've taken the train here from central New Jersey to New York a couple times, and it actually takes you right through Newark, which is where the Devils play, and actually right by their stadium. So I can't say I've really spent much time in Newark. I've, all told, I've probably spent 10 minutes, all of it on a train, so not even really in the city. Man, it's a really ugly stadium.
Is it really gross?
It's just not. It's not that pretty. And it's like the surrounding area also isn't very pretty, and this has like really no bearing on anything whatsoever. I just wanted to point that out.
You know what? When these things impress themselves upon us, that's what podcasts are for, to express those thoughts.
Yes.
So moving to number 2. On defense with the Dallas Stars, it's Miro Heiskanen.
Yes,
who we talked about before.
Yeah, we talked about Heiskanen before. Heiskanen is, of course, tangentially related to the pod as a supporting member in the Esa Lindell theory. Which is that, yeah, I mean, I have to say it again, of course.
You do it.
Well, yeah, so Esa Lindell theory is the idea that, like, the third defenseman on any team that goes deep will get a lot of unwarranted praise because people want to sound smart, and the way you sound smart is by praising the third defenseman. You can't praise any of the elite forwards because they're going to score too much, Habs notwithstanding. You can't praise either of the top 2 defensemen because that's too obvious. They're playing the top pair, and they're succeeding, obviously, because otherwise the team likely wouldn't be where they are. So you have to go to the third defenseman.
Right. I really believe this theory. It's very strong.
It's incredibly, half-baked, because I think, I think even if the way I described it, even Lindell doesn't necessarily follow that, because he actually plays first pair minutes. Right? Like realistically, he's the partner to John Klingberg. He is their second defenseman. Heiskanen is their third, anchoring kind of a second pair. But when you think of the Stars, you think of Klingberg and Heiskanen as their 2 best defensemen. You think of Lindell as the third most prominent guy, even though he probably plays the most or second most minutes. And Lindell is one of those guys whose fancy stats look awful, and probably make him out to be a worse player than he is, frankly, because I'm guessing a lot of the time, I'm guessing it's like comparing him to minutes where Klingberg and Heiskanen maybe play together, or where Klingberg is like unleashed offensively specifically. But anyways, this isn't about Esa Lindell. This is about Miro Heiskanen.
Yes.
And not just his relation to Esa Lindell theory, even though it's one of the foremost academic contributions of our time. Miro Heiskanen is really, really, really good. I love watching Heiskanen play. I think he is just so smooth. Right, that's the word that I think of when I watch him. He's just looks like a player who is really unperturbed by essentially anything going on. As a young player, his defensive results are quite impressive, and he had a bit of a down year this year. A lot of the Stars did, and certainly part of that could be the fact that COVID basically ran rampant through their entire roster at some point, and they had to play a ridiculous schedule on the back end of the year. But based on his track record at this point, I'm kind of quite comfortable having him here, and I think he could have even been number 1.
Yeah, it was tenable. And I think it really stands out how hard it is to be a really good defensive defenseman in this age bracket, because count how many others there are on this list, or that we even voted for. It's him. Quinn Hughes also made the list, but he's an offensive defenseman par excellence. Some of this is, I'm sure, coaching opportunity, but I don't buy that all coaches are idiots. I think Heiskanen is just really good defensively and has learned the game well. And I really envy that. I do think, this year on the Leafs, we got it wasn't the first time, but we got a bit of a taste of how reassuring it is to have just like a good player back there. We already had it a bit with Jake Muzzin, and we got it more with TJ Brody. Guys like that who can just steady the ship at a really high level on a consistent basis, those are valuable players. And I think Heiskanen and Klingberg is a really, really enviable 1-2 on defense. To have those guys to build around. Even if, you have Essel and Dell there to be a point of theoretical discussions. I feel like I'm repeating myself because I said some of this last year, but Heiskanen is, as much as any player on this list, I really look at him and think, God, I wish we had Miro Heiskanen.
Yeah. He's
there's not much else
very,
to say.
very, very good, right?
Yeah. Just a calm and gifted
one
player.
of the other things with Heiskanen, his role in the power play is actually kind of interesting because he is significantly more active than a lot of defensemen off the power play. He kind of plays the right side, kind of like the right point, but he has the freedom to creep in, and in fact has scored a goal from really in tight on the power play.
That's interesting.
So yeah, it's not something you would naively expect, and I believe they do spend on their top power play. They do have both Klingberg and Heiskanen, which makes sense. So Heiskanen kind of plays a role that is unusual for defensemen because most teams don't have two defensemen on power plays at this point in the NHL. I don't know how good Dallas's power play is generally. From the stats, it seems okay, but it's kind of interesting to see. Heiskanen doesn't have much finishing talent. From that, at least that hasn't been on display throughout his time in the league so far. So, I wonder if they're leaving a bit of value on the table in part because, you kind of feel obliged in some sense to have your elite defenseman on your power play. It's a status thing as much as anything else. But it's an interesting kind of quirk of his usage, generally speaking. The thing worth noting is
top 10 power play this year.
Yeah, so maybe there's something to it. The other thing worth noting is his regular partner is Jamie Alexiak, who is, I think, fine, but also certainly not concerned with the possibility that Heiskanen's getting carried. I think based on that, it's like, okay, we can be reasonably confident based on his track record and Alexiak's track record that Heiskanen is doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this pairing.
Yeah, that seems likely. It's possible they're a very nice fit. I think at their best, Muzzin and Hall have had a bit of that going on, but by the same token, I don't think anyone's under many illusions that Justin Hall is carrying that pairing. Well,
I mean, I did see a tweet that referred to him at one point as the best shutdown defender in Canada.
Come on, man. I remember when we saw that, we were like, that's not a belief that you can sustain after 5 minutes of watching them.
Well, and it's Muslin's right there.
Yeah.
he's on the ice at the same time.
Yeah, you literally look at that pairing and you're like, oh, as a person who can keep track of multiple objects in my field of vision, Jake Muzzin is clearly the better defenseman on this pairing. And that's no disrespect to Justin Hall, who I like fine. But, come on. And so by the same token, I think, Miro Heiskanen is clearly doing the lion's share of the work on that one.
Yes. Okay, so should we finish up with our number one on the list?
Yes, and so repeat listeners will probably know what's coming. So he was number 2 on our list last year. Number 1 graduated. And so now he's got first place all to himself. But at right wing for the Carolina Hurricanes, it's Andrei Svechnikov. And, he's
really good. He's really good.
I don't know if you've heard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Really the only concern, as ever with every Carolina player, is will he finish effectively? He had a bad rookie year by finishing, I believe, an average second year, and then bad again this year. So, 2 out of 3 years were a struggle in terms of finishing. We're getting far away from his draft class at this point, but I just watching him and remembering what I read about him when he was drafted, I just think he has the skill to finish, and I just think it hasn't happened yet. Maybe there's a bit of that Brady Tkachuk thing where, he's a hard-nosed guy, gets to the front of the net, creates a lot of offensive chances from in tight. Maybe some of those are not as good as XG views them. But I just have trust that he is eventually going to finish well. And when he does he's, has the chance to make an NHL all-star team. I don't mean the mid-season NHL All-Star team. I mean the NHL All-Star team at the end of the year.
Yeah, where they pick the best player at each position, with the top two. Yeah. I do also want to make a distinction. We've talked about a couple of wingers who get to the front of the net and have great chances, and then don't finish on them at the expected rate. But by HockeyViz, Brady Tkachuk is minus 15% in finishing.
Yes.
Svechnikov this year was minus 4.
Yeah, there's a cataclysmic difference between them. Like Brady Tkachuk is maybe the worst finisher in the league if you take that at face value, whereas Svechnikov is merely bad at it this year.
Yeah, and being not quite as good as expected, but on a great volume of chances, is still a pretty nice combination when it comes down to it. So he's already doing the thing at a high level. It's just, as so often on this list, the question is, where is the ceiling? And I think, we both think, he's got all of the pieces of a top 5 winger in the world. If he can put them together. It's not guaranteed that he will, but the size, the ability to drive play, to get to dangerous areas, the hand-eye coordination, the toughness under pressure, it's all there. And it's already operating at a high level.
Yeah, and he has the nastiness too.
Yeah.
Right? He's no wallflower at all. If in playoff series, opposing fans despise him by the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So he has absurd potential, really, really, really high-end potential.
Yeah.
And the finishing really is the only question mark, I think, at this point. So there's a lot of room to grow there for him. And, he's 21. He's very young still.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons we do this list, is no one on this list is hitting their peak in age by even the most youth-oriented description. They all have runway ahead of them to keep getting better. And with how good Svechnikov already is and the skill set that he's already displayed, I think there's abundant reason to expect him to. I think that, if he goes up another level, that's a dazzling thing for the Hurricanes.
Right, and yeah. I think the Hurricanes are in a very good spot, in part because they have a pretty clean cap sheet, generally speaking. But another big part of it is they have a guy who has the upside to take that stratospheric leap into the league's elite. Mm-hmm. Right? And there's no guarantee that he will. Right? But it's possible. Right? And to be fair to the Stars, they have the same thing with Heiskanen. Heiskanen could win the Norris next year, and we wouldn't be like, oh, wow, that came out of nowhere. We'd be like, yeah, you know what? In hindsight, that's pretty understandable, right? Because he's very good.
Yeah. My only question with the Hurricanes now is, if they let Dougie Hamilton go, and that seems like the way the wind is blowing, although, he hasn't signed anywhere else yet either, obviously, I do wonder how much that hurts them. Because I do think that he was their best defenseman. So
yeah, I do as well. But, I mean, if any team is set up to kind of just absorb the loss of a really, really top-level defenseman, it'd be Carolina.
That's true. And so, yeah, I mean, I think Carolina now is probably really, or should be really thinking, okay, we're knocking on the door of the top of the NHL. We've got players like Aho and Svechnikov who are exceptional and quite young. We should be thinking, now we make a move. I do want to mention, both Svechnikov and Heiskanen need new contracts. They're both RFAs right now. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that may be a factor in them letting Hamilton walk and all sorts of other decisions. But I suspect they'll both be treated as core pieces by their teams and re-signed for term. So,
yes. Before we finish up, do you think it's worth kind of very briefly discussing how these players relate to kind of the Leafs' young stars when they were in the same position, just for a couple minutes?
Yeah, and we were talking about this, obviously this is a list with no Leafs on it, with no Leafs who, to be honest, seriously threatened it. Neither of us gave...
We had Sandin and Robertson on the list of players to vote on, but I don't think either of us put them in our top 15. Yeah,
and I hope that it's clear why, frankly. You look at this list, and I'm sorry, but those players are not on a par with these players, and that's how it is.
There is no case for either of those players to be on the list, or even that close, right? Because they haven't done enough in the NHL.
Yeah, and it is what it is. But if you turn back the clock to 2017, when the Leafs would have had 3 prominent players eligible for this list, and Matthews, Marner, and Nylander, I mean, all of them would be contending for this list. First of all, if they were the ages that they are now on this list, they would all make it, I think. Like, they would all bump guys off. And, like, I would certainly have Matthews tops.
Yeah.
No question.
I think, like, if we had Matthews at age, he would have been 19 after the 2016-17 season. Marner would have just turned 20. They would, I think, be, like, 1 and 2 or, like, 1 and 3 on this list. Right? And this is, to be very clear, this is in a world where we're just transporting them at that age to now. So we're not saying against their peers at the time. If we actually did this list in 2017, they wouldn't be, because Connor McDavid was still 21.
Mm-hmm. And
right?
At that time, Eichel also would have been in there, probably at a Marner. Although that, I wouldn't rule out arguments, but I would have had Eichel ahead of him.
Yeah, I would. My 1, 2, 3 probably would have been McDavid, Eichel, Matthews, and then, McDavid, Matthews, Eichel. I'd have Matthews above Eichel, and then I'd probably put Marner.
Yeah, and then Nylander gets in towards the bottom of the list.
Yes, and then you can see again how much stronger the list was at that time than it is now, right? Because again, put 21-year-old William Nylander to right now, and I think they're like I would find it hard to see an argument where, like, Nick Suzuki is so much better than 21-year-old William Nylander. I would view them as pretty similar overall players. Yeah.
Yeah. So
whereas, if we actually did this list in 2017, Nylander would probably be like 8th to 10th, maybe not even on the list, depending on how you view other people. I think he would be on the list, but we haven't done the exercise. So
yeah, it is really striking, and obviously it's soured a little bit with the lack of playoff success since. But the Leafs had a trio of rookies that was incredibly rare in NHL history. They really were just blessed with a spectacular run of talent hitting at the same time. And it's unfortunate that, more hasn't come of it. But that was a really special stretch for them in terms of talent coming in. So, yeah, it is interesting just to look around the league and see, who's coming up, who's worth talking about, who's significant in the future. And it also helps you ground maybe your perception of our own prospects, because, I think if you asked Leafs fans on the street whether Sandin maybe or Robertson could make this list, they might not be a categorical no. And when you start doing this and you look at how many good young players there are, they're not close. It doesn't mean they're bad, but they're not close. So it can be useful just to learn about some new players and maybe learn where players are.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think that just about does it for us. You can catch all of mine and Fuleman's work at pensionplanpuppets.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at RV and AT Fuleman. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you soon.